Capitalism is about constant expansion until you overreach and collapse. That is the logic of capitalism. And that's why Marx called capitalism a revolutionary force. What happens after capitalism hollows a nation out from the inside, as ours has been, is that it feeds on the very structure that allowed capitalism to exist. So that's how you get the privatization of every aspect of civil society. The utilities, schools are privatized, intelligence services are privatized, huge mercenary forces are created to profit off of endless war. And so after destroying the superstructure of the nation, it destroys the very mechanism by which capitalism is promoted and protected and the nation itself is sustained. The end phase of capitalism, as Marx wrote, is about this privatization of civil society. And that's, of course, what we're enduring. And in order to increase profits, they are essentially dismantling systems that made the nation state function in order to cannibalize them. Significant social and political change is never going to come through elections. Elections themselves have become a form of political theater. The ruling elites control who the candidates are. You either get the kind of friendly fascism of the Democratic Party or the raw nativist party of Trump. But on all of the structural issues, all the major issues, whether it's the war budget or wholesale surveillance or austerity or taxing in any meaningful way the rich and corporations, there's no division between the Republicans and the Democrats. Trade deals, everything else. The theorist Crane Brinton, in his book on revolution, lists a certain number of preconditions that are found in pre-revolutionary societies. A discontent that affects nearly all social classes, widespread feelings of entrapment and despair, unfulfilled expectations, a unified solidarity in opposition to a tiny power elite, a refusal by scholars and thinkers to continue to defend the actions of the ruling class, an inability of government to respond to the basic needs of citizens, a steady loss of will within the power elite itself, together with defections from the inner circle, a crippling isolation that leaves the power elite without any allies or outside support, and a financial crisis. So the preconditions that Crane Brinton lays out in his book have more than been met by the devolution of American democracy and American society. And that is why the forms of social control have become more lethal, more widespread, and more draconian, embodied primarily in wholesale government surveillance, militarized police, and the largest prison system in the world. The ruling classes now openly use coercion in order to contain widespread discontent. But of course we are seeing blowback, especially embodied in these Christianized fascistic forces that Trump, who didn't create them, tapped into and exploited, and which are growing under the Biden administration. So I think we would have to add a footnote to Brinton to say that all of those conditions can lead to the embrace of an autocratic society as well as a socialist or a revolutionary society. The forces that drove people into the arms of the Nazi Party were the same forces that drove people into the arms of the Communist Party in Germany, with perhaps the dividing line being that most of the Nazi supporters were rural and the urban industrial proletariat gravitated towards the communists. But the failure on the part of the Weimar government to respond to the most basic needs of the population, especially after the 1929 crash when they actually abolished unemployment benefits, essentially pushes people into the extremes. The left in the United States has been destroyed and decimated, so it's pushing people, especially the white working class, into the arms of this Christianized fascism. Marx was always disdainful of what he called the lumpen proletariat. That's not the proletariat. Those are the poorest elements of the working class, people who often have suffered tremendous abuse, economic deprivation, and trauma. And they're easily recruited into fascistic forces that carry out violence on behalf of the ruling elites. That's true in every society I've been in. The Basiji in Iran were recruited from the slums of Tehran and sent up to terrorize and brutalize in gangs the middle and upper classes in the city, and did so with a great deal of enthusiasm because these were the people who they believed with much justification were responsible for their own poverty and marginalization. So any society produces a significant element among the lower classes that are willing to do the dirty work of the ruling regime, i.e. carry out acts of violence. That's what the brown shirts were, for example. That's what the gun thugs, the Pinkertons, were, who murdered on behalf of the mine owners in southern West Virginia or in the steel mills in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of American workers were murdered in the labor wars, far more than in any other industrialized country, and they were murdered by people from the same socioeconomic group who were given a license to carry out acts of violence and a kind of immunity from prosecution and a certain financial reward for doing so. So unfortunately, that is an element in any society that is seeking to dethrone a ruling elite. You immediately are going to have forces from your own socioeconomic group who will carry out acts of violence on behalf of that elite. The ruling class wants people to respond in the one language they can speak far better than we can, and that's violence. So of course they'll provoke, push, carry out egregious acts of violence. But what they're seeking to is to get a violent response, because one, then they can demonize and contain any kind of serious resistance movement, and that justifies a series of national security laws to crush it. So violence is a terrible, terrible mistake, which I've long said, it just doesn't work. The only way to break the back, and this is true for every revolution throughout history, of any discredited ruling elite is to appeal to the conscience of a certain segment of that ruling elite to defect, or at least not to intervene. That creates paralysis. So if you go back and look at all of the revolutions throughout history, it's when, for instance, the Shah fled the country and the head of the armed forces said he would no longer defend the regime. It's when the Tsar abdicated and the Cossacks refused to fire on the protesters in St. Petersburg. I mean, just throughout history, that's how it works. People got seduced by the Foucault theory propagated by Fidel and Che. The Foucault theory is the idea that you build a tiny group of armed resistors who begin to carry out violent acts against the state, and then that incites a revolution. But all of the attempts to replicate that theory, including by the SDS in the United States, were disasters. And in fact, the Foucault theory was untrue. There was an element around Fidel, but what brought down the Batista regime were national strikes by the labor unions. So we will have to build movements that threaten the power elites. Otherwise, we're finished.